My name is Alexandra Sandu. I'm the Associate Director for the Humanities Research Fellowship Program, and I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome all of you, and also just to um, introduce this wonderful workshop today entitled The Craft of the Book and the Business of Publishing. I'll leave the introductions to our lovely editors, but also to Mark, who has agreed to moderate this event and give you a brief description of the fellowship program. We started this program back in 2014, and we aim to build a platform of outstanding research relevant to the field of the study of the Arab world, but from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds. Excuse me. For the last 9 years, we've hosted over 50 junior, mid-career, as well as senior scholars here at NYU Abu Dhabi. And they come from really all over the world. We have a yearly cohort of 10 to 12 research fellows, some of them sitting right across or near you right now. And they're conducting research on the study of the Arab world from different perspectives. We are also hosting several events with fellows and faculty here at NYU Abu Dhabi, so we very much encourage you to have a look at our programming for this semester, and we hope to welcome you to some of our reading seminars or the writing seminars that are happening on a weekly basis. We are very grateful again to Professor Mark Swislowski, who is the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development, and the Associate Professor of History at NYU Abu Dhabi for moderating our event today. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you and Natalie for inviting me to play this role, which I do also on behalf of the Division of Arts and Humanities in an effort to build closer relations among researchers in the division and researchers in the fellowship program. I will meet, I may ask a question that's related to myself as an author as well later, and I'll meet with one of these editors later to talk about my own work, but I'm here today to help facilitate a conversation for everyone in the room. I want to start by introducing our guests briefly, and then I want to do, for their benefit and for all of our benefit, a quick survey of the room to help set us up for the conversation. Kate Wahl, who is on the right, is editor-in-chief and publishing director at Stanford University Press. She acquires books in Middle East Studies, a publishing area she launched at SUP in 2004, and also develops general interest books for Stanford University Press's trade imprint, Redwood Press. Kate holds degrees in religious studies and violin performance, and when not reading manuscripts, remains an active musician in the San Francisco Bay Area. Katherine Wiley, to her left, is an academic developmental editor at her company, Goldenrod Editorial. She works with scholars in the qualitative social sciences and humanities, assisting them in meeting their publishing goals by helping them think through the bigger picture issues with their work, including argument, structure, narrative flow, and voice. Clients of hers have published or are under contract with a range of university presses, including Indiana, Oxford, Princeton, Rutgers, and Stanford. The former tenured professor, Katherine has her PhD in anthropology from Indiana University. She also has published an ethnography that focuses on gender, slavery work, and Islam in Mauritania. When not editing, she enjoys keeping up with her 5-year-old Felix, clogging, and gardening. I want to just start out briefly by asking you just to raise your hand in response to a couple of questions so that our speakers can get a sense of the room. How many of you here are here because you're contemplating your first book publication? That is, you're about to become a first-time author or you're anticipating being a first-time author? How many are people who are authors of published books in the room? How many are authors of more than one published book in the room? Okay. Just want to get a sense of who we are. And in part, I think to indicate that the advice we're about to hear, I think will be relevant to people at different stages of careers. And that just because you've published one book, it doesn't mean you don't have a lot to learn about how you get the second one started, let alone finished and off to press. But we also have people in the room then who are at different stages of their career and who've begun research at different stages in the history of publication and book publishing. And so I was hoping to start off with a general question to ask each of you to reflect from your general perspectives and with regard to the specific kind of work you do, how different the publishing world is today for academics than it was, say, a decade ago, when some of us might have first published a book or have started the career toward publishing a book with certain expectations about what we might have found at the end because of what our mentors told us to anticipate. But we might find ourselves in a somewhat different situation that we need to recalibrate ourselves for. So could you reflect a little bit on what's changed for academic publishing in the last 10 years or so?
Answering that question, my first thought, it goes into a very, like, what's changed in the work of publishing, and certainly the market and the economy of publishing has shifted over the 20 plus years I've been doing this. But I think there's opportunities and challenges for you as scholars and authors that have shifted. That I think the pressures I see have increased, certainly. The pressures to publish earlier or faster, I think, have increased. But equally, I think there are so many more opportunities like this workshop or other aspects of postdoctoral fellowships, manuscript workshops, where I think universities are realizing that support is needed to help develop and give space to writing manuscripts. So I see both the advantages and contrasts there of an urgency towards speed and a greater support towards manuscript development. And where you can start to really engage with things, opportunities like this, to be able to take a step back and think about what it is to write a manuscript and the craft of a manuscript. Even if you're feeling the pressures of time, positions, I think, is a great opportunity and is leading to perhaps better structured, more coherent projects. One of the shifts, when I mentioned the business of publishing, is that the strains on the finances of it. University libraries have much tighter budgets. The space for the specialist monograph is not as robust for publishers anymore. That just thinking through how many copies are sold, how we cover our costs of producing something. And I think there's also at the same time been an interest among scholars to reach wider readerships at the same time. And so I think that, again, I see those tensions as a negative and a positive, that where we can embrace your interest in reaching students and reaching wider readerships and reaching either multidisciplinary readerships. That's an opportunity publishers have right now to work with you as well to craft books for bigger readerships. Simultaneously, we're seeing a shrinkage of those very specialized, narrow readership books and spaces to be selling those. So I think those are the key tensions that come up to me right away, and opportunities for writing for authors.
I'll echo the idea that I think presses are looking for books that reach somewhat wider audiences. That doesn't mean like New York Times bestsellers. So of course, everyone would like love that, but it's harder for presses to publish really specialized monographs. So when authors approach me, which is that happens at different stages of the publishing process, but it's often once they've been in contact with the press and the press says something like, this topic is interesting, but we're not going to be able to publish it as it is. We need it to be reworked so that it appeals to a broader audience. And so I'd say in this changing landscape, I published my book, like I finished graduate school in 2013 and my book came out in 2018. And I feel like it's shifted even like since then. So if I were writing my book today, I would be thinking differently, right? Rather than mine it's definitely specialist. It's primarily for people who are interested in like gender in West Africa or slavery in Mauritania. You can imagine those are like somewhat narrow audiences. I would be trying to think, how can I reframe to just make the appeal broader and bring out themes and arguments that would be of interest more broadly. So I think as people who are writing books, it's good to think about these things early so that you can kind of be prepared and not just like at the peer review process suddenly be like, right. So yeah.
So it sounds like there's a potential, and I want to ask you if you could address this. There's a potential for a kind of friction between especially the expectations that are placed on a junior scholar to demonstrate specialized expertise for a specialized audience and the marketplace for publishing. And I think that this is just a feature of the landscape. It's not necessarily the fault of universities or of the publishing world. But how would you then, how do you discuss this friction with first-time authors who are trying to figure out how to navigate both the expectations of their profession for review by their peers and by their senior colleagues, but also the realities of what they're going to be able to do given the requirements of the marketplace?
I think so much is about choices and trade-offs of any type of book. And I think this is not unique either to all of you writing a first book. I think this is a case of, I could talk about this with authors writing their fifth or sixth book. And just to clarify, it's not that we don't publish specialized monographs, but that there are just different considerations in how we position. As an editor, I acquire a wide range of styles of books. And in fact, as editor-in-chief set up for my department, every editor has a portfolio of different types of books to bring in, and a certain number of trade books, a certain number of monographs, a certain number of books that are going to be used in academic coursework. So I think for me, I start with authors of trying to figure out what is the book you want to write? Who is it that you want to talk to? And what is most important to achieve with this particular book? I think the advantage of a monograph is you can really get into very specialized material. You can go into a great deal of nuance and depth of an argument that you're not going to be able to do if your interest is a much broader argument, or to provide a more general theorization for people who are not specialists in the field. The trade-off of doing that specialized monograph, of course, is the market is much narrower, which means publishers are going to price the book much higher. So I think it's going in, and that's part of why I'm suggesting the title for this and looking at craft and business of publishing. We're looking at both simultaneously. What is, if we choose to write a book in a certain way, choose to position a book in our list in a certain way, what does that mean then about for the publisher side? And this is just to give you a sense of the editors are always working on that business side as well. What will that mean for us to be able to produce this book? To be absolutely clear, university press publishing is a mission-based publishing. We are not looking to make money off, we are looking to cover costs and to be able to support our efforts, but it is not a trade house in commercial publishing. So that does give us that space. My first question looking at any book proposals, is this a good book? What are you doing with this book? What argument are you making and who are you speaking to with it? And then how do we make sure the manuscript is crafted in the right way to achieve that ambition and for that readership? And then I speak with the authors about what does that mean about how the narrative style, the structure of your manuscript, the level of detail or not. And so start working at a very early stage of trying to categorize types of books and the opportunities you would have with each. Any book could be written in multiple different ways, and it's making choices at every stage, but thinking about it quite early is, I think, one of the most important things to get out of this conversation and all your thinking on manuscript of who are you writing to, why are you writing this book, what do you want to say with it?
Yeah, and I'll echo the question of audience, who are you writing to, and thinking that through. I think as dissertation writers, you're basically writing to 4 or 5 committee members, right? And it's a very narrow audience. And often, I was thinking, I haven't gone back to my dissertation, but if I did, I would be able to say that part was because of Maria, or this was for Beth, right? And so on. And some of those things are wonderful, right? But I think when you're turning to the book and this tension between what your university needs to see and what presses are looking for, think about audience and then thinking about what those audiences might need. So one thing I see a lot of authors doing is thinking more about, okay, I want this to be a monograph, but I want it to be something that could potentially be taught, right? Which increases, and I think most of us want our work to be read by not just 20 people, hopefully, right? But if you are going to write a book that you hope will be taught, you may need to give more background, for example, than you would if it was just for people who have PhDs in that discipline. So kind of as you're thinking through what book I want to write, like what are the needs of that audience, but definitely keeping your needs from your department and where you're located in mind as well, right? Because if you're not going to get promoted, if you don't have a certain kind of book, that's a choice. You could make that choice, but you want to be sure that's a choice you want to make. So having conversations, I think, with your department and where you're situated to be clear on tenure expectations and promotion expectations, and making sure you can find a press where these things kind of align, as well as hopefully you're like, of course you want to write the book you really want to write.
I'm struck, Kate, by how you talked about an early engagement with an editor, and I think back to my own engagement with Stanford University Press, which I was very relieved published my book quite a few years ago. I wrote kind of a cold letter to an editor on the advice of a colleague who had also published with Stanford, and I dropped this person's name, who said I should write to Muriel Bell, who, as she was an outgoing editor, who had been there for many years in my field, history of China. And I described the book to her, and she said, well, why don't you write back to me? She said, I wrote a book about food. She said, I always wanted to write a book, publish a book about food in China. So I felt, okay, I have my foot in the door. And then she said, well, send me a proposal and a chapter. And I sent her a proposal and a chapter, and she said, okay, let's work together. But the next step was submit the whole manuscript. And then I submitted the whole manuscript, and it went out for review, and I got back a few pages of comments and a contract, basically. If I met the terms for revising it, that would happen. And I revised it, and it met the terms, and that was it. You're talking about a really different way of engaging with an author now. Now it worked for me. I had other people to read the work, but I didn't feel like I got edited in a way. And so I wonder if both of you play very different roles as editors, and you have different, responsibilities and priorities with your work. So what role, Kate, would you play as an editor-in-chief or someone who's acquiring books? When should someone reach out to you? What can they expect back from you? And what would those stages look like? But then, Katherine, could you talk about what a developmental editor is? This was not a word that anyone ever mentioned to me when I was in graduate school, let alone writing my first book afterwards. But now it seems like it's what I think I might have once thought an editor was supposed to do, but maybe it's different. So could you sort of, and I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is, can you also let everyone know when you, as in your role, you would expect them to reach out to you, and what you would tell them at different stages of engaging in the writing process?
I would find, in talking with editors, and you'll hear me probably say this many times a day, that often the answer, or the way I start almost every question asking about publishing is, well, it depends, because the process is, there is a similar rhythm and structure to it, but it's going to be different. It's, for me, different by each book, by each author, and you're certainly going to see differences across different presses. So to Mark, where you started, having conversations with authors conversations with editors is a really useful, important thing to do if you can, whether those are, we have a lot more conversations by Zoom now. That's maybe a good thing the pandemic gave us. And so you're not so much of dependent on being at physically in the same place, or being at a conference to meet with people. And so the more you can work with and talk with editors, take a look at our catalogs, I'd say, just as a general statement, the more you can, the better that's going to be to get a sense of each publisher. But in terms of when you start working with someone, I have found that it's a little different by each author and each project. I would encourage you, as soon as you know what the book is you want to write, as soon as you have a book proposal that you'd like to share and start that conversation, that's the right time to start. For some people, that's 2 years, maybe 3 years before you are going to have a manuscript in hand to submit. For other people, though this is, I will say, more the minority, and for my preference, I would not necessarily recommend this, it's sending a proposal when the manuscript's already done and saying, I could share it with you. The key reason that I I somewhat just say that that's not my preference, is that I also take, when I see a proposal and it's similar to yours, like I'll read through a book proposal, think, does this fit with my list, with what I'm acquiring right now, with the areas that we're publishing? Does it align with books that I published recently? Is it too close to some of those books? There's constant balancing in developing a publishing program between finding books that are on complementary areas and topics, readerships and markets, and then also making sure that we're not just simply duplicating the same material and extending and developing a program as the academic discipline extends and develops. So I'll take a look at that book proposal, and that starts the conversation for me with an author. In many cases, for me, as I read through a proposal, I'll write back to them and say, this looks great, but have you thought about, or here's my questions about the structure of your manuscript, the argument, the framing you're making. Could you clarify for me what the function of chapter 2 is, or why you chose to put these chapters in a particular order? Or there could also be a sense of, in reading through the framing of the book, have you thought about framing this book in a different way that's larger or more ambitious, or suggesting that the way the manuscript is written is very jargon laden, but you've said you want to write for general readership. So there are different ways looking at how the material is structured and the stated readership. That's the type of feedback. And again, this is all at a proposal stage that I've read through a proposal. Some other projects come in, they're already very well conceived. And so yeah, that may be something I'll write back and say, this looks great. I would like to see the full manuscript. Please send it in when it's ready. Where if I see in a manuscript, in a proposal, as I was saying, that if you submit it at the time that you're finished with your manuscript, I often take that to mean this is an author who you're sure of what you want to write and probably don't want as much back and forth and engagement. Whether or not that's what you're intending to signal, that is something that I kind of look at to see, what is the right level of engagement and feedback. Some authors I work quite closely with, some I do not, because I think their projects are already well developed, or they know what they want, and I'll then take it as to say, how does this manuscript as it is fit our list? So there's a lot of give and take in there. From inviting, so after reading a proposal, I'll invite the manuscript. Again, that could be anywhere from having a manuscript ready to go a few weeks from now after that invitation to several years after that invitation. With first books, more often than not, our preference is to wait to review the full manuscript with external peer reviewers. There is the opportunity, and some publishers also do that peer review based on sample material, the book proposal, and some chapters, and you can get a contract at that stage as well. For Stanford and most university press publishers, any contract, whether it's based on a proposal or on the full manuscript, is going to be dependent on peer review process. See, that gets us, when you submit the full manuscript, we also send that out for peer review. And that is a very significant part of the development we do, in addition to my own work, working with authors on the manuscripts, working to find the right readers to work through a manuscript, and especially for more specialized material, for monographs, that the peer review is going to be some of the key development work we do, making sure that it's the argument is clear, it's well structured, and that it's convincing to specialists in the field. I'll work with authors in evaluating the reviews that we get back and saying, what makes sense to do, which revisions do you want to do, which ones don't make sense for this manuscript, might push it in a different direction than what you as the author want to be doing. And so that's another level of engagement with our authors, not just on the manuscript or the proposal itself, on the structure, but also on the peer review process. And then I work with the authors in the final versions to get those manuscripts properly developed, to get them into production as well. So, and I think your experience is going to be, Mark, your reflection is not necessarily uncommon of either Stanford at the time that you're publishing, or some presses now. And I think that's an important thing to be thinking for yourself. What level of feedback do you want? You're going to find that different from each publishing house, each editor you work with. We at Stanford, even about 10 years ago, one of the things we did was lower the number of projects we expect each editor to be working on, so that we could do more direct engagement in the manuscript, working very closely with our authors in clearer feedback and editorial work. We don't go, Katherine and I are just speaking about the difference between what an editor does as development versus a development editor. And so I think we're not going to go into as much detail or engagement as, and Katherine, not speak for you, speak to what you're doing, but my own work might often be on a couple chapters, and then say you could potentially extrapolate from this across the rest of your manuscript, or to encourage people to work with a development editor. But I think we as a press do a lot more hands-on editing. What people say, there are other publishing houses that their editors are working on many more books in a year. We're usually at Stanford signing 20 to 25 books, publishing that in a year. There are publishing houses that do 60 or 80 books in a year per editor. And of course, those editors are not able to do as much in-depth work. So that's something to start to figure out too for yourself of how do you want to engage? And there's no right or wrong here necessarily, but what level do you really want a hands-on editor, or do you want someone who's a bit more reserved? And talk to editors, take a look at publishing houses to find your right fit for your style of work.
And that's a good question to ask if you have brief meetings, like initial meetings with editors, to try to get a sense of how they work with authors, because my experience was exactly yours. I don't think I had a great editor, but I really only got feedback from the peer review process. And yeah, anyway, so right, finding an editor, hopefully they can match the kind of feedback you want. So developmental editors, I didn't know about developmental editors until after my book was out, and I was like, what, this exists? I can't believe it. So we work with authors to help them think through bigger picture issues with their books. So we don't do like copy editing and grammar stuff. We're helping you talk through argument, structure, organization, flow, audience, kind of what kind of book you want. We typically, some presses may still like have some developmental editors on staff or pay for them themselves, but typically we're working directly with authors now who pay us through research funds and sometimes out of pocket, depending on their situation. I'll talk about when to approach developmental editors, but just so you know kind of what a developmental edit might look like. And one thing I'll say is, like acquisitions editors, developmental editors all work differently as well. There's not really, it's not necessarily standardized. So if you're like interviewing editors looking to work with someone, you want to ask them about how they work with authors and what their process looks like to make sure that you find someone who is doing what you're looking for, what you're hoping for. A full developmental edit for me is like 2 reads of a manuscript, making comments in the margin, sometimes doing some line editing as well, like working in the text, though not necessarily, and then writing an editorial letter, which is a document that summarizes sort of the argument of the book and some of the strengths, and then provides suggestions and direction for revision. And again, about these big picture issues. And I think one difference between developmental editors and peer reviewers, so sometimes peer reviewers do this, is developmental editors' job is not just to say, you know, like, hey, the structure isn't working for these reasons, but also to help you chart pathways forward through which you could address those issues. So a developmental editor might have some ideas about the organization of your manuscript and be able to give you some possible ways to reorganize to make it clearer and so on. Developmental editors work with authors at every stage of the process. So again, it's kind of figuring out when working with an editor might be helpful for you. So some people approach me when they haven't written a word and they say, like, I want to work with somebody throughout this process. I want help sort of talking through the idea, conceptualizing of the book. And then they may send me chapters as they write them. And so I'm reading chapters as they go, helping them think through not just the individual chapters, but then eventually like how they fit together, right? So I might be giving feedback on chapter 4, but saying, you know what, after reading this, I'm wondering maybe it makes sense earlier in the book for these reasons. But then people also come to developmental editors with a full manuscript before it goes to peer review, wanting to get feedback at that stage and submit the strongest manuscript they can. Some people come to me after peer review, wanting help figuring out how to incorporate those reviews into the manuscript. That can be a really overwhelming state. An author came to me who had, one of the peer reviews was 20 single space pages, right? The person was like, my head is exploding. Like, what do I do? And sometimes I work with people who have resubmitted a revised manuscript for the press, and the press says, hey, it still needs more work. And so anyway, so basically you'd want to, if you do think working with a developmental editor might be useful for you. You want to think about your project, your budget, and when you think it might be most helpful. Some people really like working in a sense with a partner. Others prefer to, produce the manuscript on their own and then get some feedback later on in the process. But anyway, yeah, developmental editors are happy to work at other stages. And we also work on articles, job materials, other documents you have to produce as part of academic life.
It's striking to me that in both cases, that even though you're doing really different work, your answer seems to be that you engage us depending on what level of engagement you want us to play in the production of the work. And that's really, it puts sort of the onus on us to think about that before we engage with you, which we might not actually have done because we haven't done it before, or we didn't think that that was what we were supposed to do as authors.
I think to that, a lot of as an editor is making sure to ask the right questions to help an author think through those. If someone hasn't yet come up with the answers, it's often because they haven't thought of the questions of, what do I want this book to do? Who am I writing for? And so to help guide and tease that out of the thinking is part of the editorial process as well.
I think part of the fear of approaching an editor might be rejection. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about when, if you do ever say, no, I can't work with you to someone, why you might do that, and what you would advise us to keep in mind if that happens, to any of us, because it seems like people at least fear this will happen. I don't know how often it actually does, maybe more often than not. I tried something recently once. I was told this isn't ready yet. I knew it wasn't ready, but I had been expected to write a book proposal for a review, right? Yeah. So, but in a real situation, right? How do you navigate this, and what do you think we can learn from how you think about that?
Say if you can, don't approach publishers too early. If you can have some more informal conversations, if you are at academic conferences, absolutely take advantage of that, just to have introductory conversations, to browse publishers' booths, start to see their books. But sending in a proposal, it should be complete enough. I think it's not that it needs to be the perfect proposal, and it may not necessarily be reflect where the book will end up, but it needs to be coherent and complete. It needs to tell a very good story and framework of what you think the book is that you want to be writing right now, and crafted for that level of readership, the style of writing, that you can see the framework of the book, the narrative and arc of the project. So I pay a lot of attention to the chapter descriptions to see from the general description. So we haven't actually talked about what a proposal has in it, so maybe I should take that step back. Because I'm realizing I'm using a lot of this and probably it's not as clear. So in a book proposal, it's going to have, every publisher has their own instructions and what they generally prefer to see on their website. Take a look at that for your specific publishers you're submitting to. But in general, what we're asking for is a statement of a couple pages, perhaps, that gives us a sense of the book as a whole, the overview of the project, the framework, and the argument you're making with it. And then you'll have a section that breaks that down into chapter by chapter discussion. When I'm reading those chapters, I'm looking to see, how are you moving from the big statement you made about what this book does? How is that then developed from one chapter to the next? Can I see where the narrative or analytical arc is that's developing through the book? The proposal also includes a statement on the market. So that's who you're writing for and what else is already published. What books are comparable to yours, either in topic or in readership, that have been published recently? And a key aspect of that is that there are two different levels on which you want to assess the market. Books in general that are out right now in the field, published by anyone, that are fairly recent and on this topic. And then it's very useful to also say books published by the publisher you're submitting to. And for key reason, that'll get back to the question of when it is and is not a fit. And finally, in the proposal, you want to say, who are you? Why are you writing this book? Why do you have the expertise and the platform? That's more narrative than just provide your CV. We can glean aspects of this, but part of what we're looking for is as editors and publishers is why this book, why for these readers, and why you to do that. And that's what I'm looking for in a good book proposal, should start to answer those questions. And that gives me the material to start to work with, to answer authors and start to engage and either say, I'm fully convinced by what you have now, or I can see a kernel of something really great in here. Let's keep talking and develop it further. So when you feel like you have that coherent statement in a book proposal, that's the time to approach publishers or start. You don't want to send it in too early, because if we get so much material, we're looking, and this, I hesitate to say this, but to be blunt, we're looking for reasons not to accept things often. I also at Stanford, we accept less than 5% of the proposals that are submitted to us. And I don't think that's necessarily too out of line with a lot of the university press publishers. So I offer that not as a point to scare people, but just to say, there's a reason you want to make sure you stand out. You want to make sure you've given some thought to and are convinced by the proposal you're submitting. And you also want to don't take it too hard if you aren't invited to submit your manuscript or told it's not a fit. Fit is the key word here, and that goes both ways. We're looking to find books that fit with our program. You should be looking to find the publisher that fits with your interests and the editor that fits with what you want to be doing. More often than not, if I've declined a project, it's not because I think it's bad or it doesn't work or that I couldn't see it published any number of places, but it's because it's not a fit with what I'm looking for at this time in terms of the topic and the way it's positioned, the types of readers that are going to position, and the priorities I've set for the list area I have for wanting to sign in a certain sub-discipline, for wanting to complement books I already have on the list. And so either you can, with that fit, and especially looking at the topic of fit, something could be too far to the side and doesn't complement what we already have. We as publishers are looking to build clusters of books. That also helps in the marketing of our projects, that we can bring everything together, that readers know to come to Stanford for a certain type or area of book. If something is truly an outlier, it's not going to find its readership. There's the other side of fit too, that we have too many books on a certain topic or want to start to extend the list in a new way. I've also declined projects because they are so similar to something I've published of late, and really it's going to be to your advantage to make sure that you're in a list that can be distinctive, where your book will stand out. And so that's, to a certain extent, that is the decision-making process and the thought that goes behind when I've declined a project. I tend to, and I think most editors will tend not to explain in great detail why we haven't accepted a project. And it's not to avoid the responsibility of it, but I think because one editor's opinion is not necessarily what you should take, especially when we're not pursuing the project. Every publishing house is going to position a book a little differently. Every editor is going to find something slightly different that interests them. And so responding to any advice that I might be able to give when I'm not pursuing it, I feel like could potentially lead an author down the wrong path on that. So I think that's a way. If you can, I know it's a very personal reaction. I mean, we certainly feel it as publishers, knowing that there's so much put on a project to decline and not pursue it. It's not an easy decision, but I would even say it's a practical decision, and you should take it, not to indicate that it's not going to find publication elsewhere, but to find a better fit for your project and take a look at other publishing houses that might be more similar to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I always suggest to authors that it's a good idea to have more than one publisher in mind. You might have a house you're like so excited and it's your dream press, and hopefully that will work out, but it's good to have other presses who maybe you're also entering into conversation with to sort of keep doors open. And another reason that can be a good thing is sometimes editors, and I'm working with an author who is writing a book. It's a history book, and different chapters are organized around different historical figures in the place he's writing about. And he talked to one press and they said, we like the book, we'd be interested in pursuing it, but we want you to make the chapters more thematic. So kind of take away the biographical focus and make this change. And then another press was like, we like it and we like the biography thing. So, and he decided, I think I like the biography thing and that's the book I want to write. And so he ultimately went with that press. And so it also just, you want to know, because different presses will have different feedback, and often that feedback can transform the book in really exciting ways. But if you have multiple you're talking to different people, you can make choices. And people, authors often ask me, like, how do you figure out which press and like which lists match with your work? A couple ways to go about that are look at your bookshelf, like what books do you love that you use in your work that may overlap in some ways, who publishes them. You also, it's great to talk to other authors. So, you know, folks in your department both could share experiences with where they've published, but also may have lots of ideas for you about where to publish. So those are some places to start. And looking at press often talk, they have like specific lists. So Cornell has a list on French colonial history in Africa, right? And so when like figuring out where are lists that overlap with your topics can be really useful as well.
Certainly prioritize recently published books. I think that gives you something. There's can be editorial turnover. There's also evolution and changes in the list. So if when looking at your bookshelves, looking at your bibliography, who's published most recently in an area, not if the book is 10, 15 years old, our list may be in a very different place. And I'll share, I assume as an editor that when receiving a proposal, you don't necessarily need to submit to multiple publishers at one time, but I assume in a way that you are. I think that's also feel completely comfortable, and be the best thing you do is upfront and very clear and transparent with your editors of this is submitted to these multiple places. Craft your proposal, craft your cover letter, craft that market space to each publisher. But you should, at this early stage, have conversations with multiple places. And I absolutely agree. And you should be looking more broadly to see where possible different fits could come. When it comes to the peer review process, that's usually where most publishers will ask for an exclusive submission. That would show just because of the time, not just the time and resources the press is putting into it, but that your peer reviewers are putting into that as well. But up into the point of starting a formal peer review process, whether on proposal material or on a full manuscript, so there's no expectation of exclusivity.
That was actually the question that I was going to ask next, about whether it was ethical and at what point to engage more than one. Because I was under the impression one, and then you wait, and if it's 5%, you're really risking a lot for a long period of time. So early on, it's okay to be broad, but once you get a relationship established, it's good to be.
And just be really transparent.
Okay. I have quite a few other questions. I know that there are other people here who must have questions, and maybe I'll just ask one broad question and then we can open it up for discussion. The publishing world has changed, I think, perhaps not just because of the market tensions that we've talked about, but because of things like open access, because of new publication formats, especially in the case of digital scholarship. And I wonder now also because of AI, artificial intelligence, and how this might transform the industry. Could you, is there anything that any of us should keep in mind about these issues as we think about approaching an editor, or as we think about developing a project that we should anticipate in 3 to 5 years is actually gonna, when we're done, we're gonna be in a different publishing world that you can kind of begin to see? Or should we not think that far ahead? Because it seems like it always seems like there are a lot of changes on the horizon, but it's hard to know which ones are gonna matter. And so how do you advise us when we're thinking about using AI to write our abstracts, for example, or our book proposals, right? I mean, this is going to happen, right? But then there's open access, there's digital scholarship, there's all kinds of stuff that's changing, not just the publication, but the marketing and even the writing books.
While there are so many way different formats, different ways that, especially ebooks, digital library collections have shifted in publishing. There's also a lot of these business shifts are on the actual publishing side, that we now have different ways of books being printed and economies of scale in our publications. We don't need to print as many books, which is actually a benefit now that it's changed. We no longer, books used to go out of print. There really is no such thing as going out of print anymore, because we can print on demand, we can print individual copies. So that's actually a great benefit of what's happened in technology. still ultimately at the end of the day, we're talking about whatever format the book is in, whether it's a digital ebook, it's a Kindle, or it's a print book. There's still that idea of the long form argument, the structure of the book, it has remained the same in many ways. And so I think that that is the key. And for me as an editor and working with you as authors, that's really what I'm thinking about most. And first is, what is the book you're writing? Who are you writing for? We'll get to that question. I mean, what's the best way to produce it? How are we going to sell it? What do we price it at? And what's that, the physical copy or the digital copy going to be? But that doesn't necessarily change how do you write a good book? How do you think as an author? How do you think as an editor about the craft of your book? So we're trying to guess what the future is going to be. It's hard to do so, but even as I look back now, the shift into ebook, the rise of the ebooks over the last 20 years, there's a lot that stayed really the same too. Even as the format, the ultimate publication format, maybe there's just more of them, basically that.
I think there's some exciting opportunities for authors with, say, digital humanities and things like this. Some of the scholars I'm working with do digital humanities projects that accompany their books or articles. So an example is someone's writing a different biography and went to a lot of archives and is creating this digital humanities site where students or whatever could sort of visit different archives and experience some of these documents. So I think some of that stuff is exciting. I will say, don't use projects like that to avoid writing your book, which can happen sometimes, right? So like if you need to write a book, but the stuff is nice. One thing Mark had said he might ask about AI, and I realized like I don't really know much about AI and publishing, so I was doing some reading about it yesterday, and one thing it said, which I hadn't known, is different publishing houses and journals and so on are coming out with policies on AI use in scholarship. And so if for any reason you are thinking of incorporating AI, I don't know if you statistics or something, you'd want to like really be careful to make sure you're ethically using it and adhering to guidelines in those ways. But,
yeah. Well, thank you for answering my questions. I'm sure there's quite a few questions in the room. So we'd like to open up, and there's a hand right there. So let's start.
Yeah,
and could I just ask you to introduce yourself briefly to the
Ali
speaker?
Suleiman, I work in visual culture studies, and actually I want to thank Kate because she helped me 2 years ago with my proposal, and a similar, but it was on Zoom during COVID, and I found a publisher that I liked, and now in production and books coming out in a few months. I'm wondering about the next stage and my engagement with the book. So I heard a lot of things from my publisher about my responsibility to promote the book, but also I'm wondering about kind of keeping the book alive, and no one wants to see their book go out of print or become like, okay, archived and that's it. So I'm wondering if I can get some advice on that from you, my responsibility as the author of the book.
Certainly, it's authors or marketing of a book is best done as a collaborative process. And I think approach it assuming that is the case. And publishers have great and deep networks into more professional channels. We know how to send out review copies, get them to various media. We have publicists who can pitch the book. We can support books at conferences. Their advertisements, these are things that publishers are set up to do very well. And that is the publisher side of sales and marketing and publicity. But equally important is your side of it. And I think if you think through how you get to know books, social media certainly has increased this of you, but as a key place to have word of mouth and know what books are interesting you, who's working on things, but it's your personal networks that publishers don't have access to, that you do. And when the publisher works through their networks and you work through your personal networks, that's when a book, I think, gets the most announcement, especially immediately upon publication. The other is, publishers, we're looking to market a book for a reasonable period of time, but really the focus is upon publication. There's the lead up time to get review copies out, to work with our sales team before publication, and then for maybe number of months following publication. And as a university press publisher, we will also be including books in subject catalogs, taking them to conferences for a couple of years afterwards. But really, you should expect to see that the publisher's marketing gets done in the months around publication, and then going to conferences and having things in catalogs in the years after publication. Your own work can possibly extend that time period of either doing finding opportunities to give talks, lectures, sharing information. If you have a social media platform, using that to connect with your readerships. I think the more ambition you have for wider readership, the more necessary it is to think through even before publication. How do you reach your readers? How are you connected with them? And that's part of, even in a book proposal, I was saying, you want to make sure I look to see a narrative statement about why are you the author to write this book. Is not just, that's a question of expertise, but it's also how do you connect with your readers? Why are people already coming to you? Or how are you going to build that over the time that you're writing your book? How are you going to start to connect with your readerships, develop those networks, those conversations, so that when the time the book comes out, you have those channels already in place to start to share information? I think often that can sound overwhelming, but it's also thinking through how are you already connecting with your field on a daily, monthly, yearly basis, and how do you work in news about your book publication into that as well. And so I think publishers, that's something you can work with your editor early on, and saying what are the opportunities for your own book, but start thinking creatively and watching how other people are pitching their books when they come out. But it's definitely have that expectation that you are going to have to get out in front of your book and partner with your publisher to market your book, especially upon publication. As time goes by, I think you have to accept we want to be supporting our books in backlist, but as years and years go by, especially the publisher's interests are going to be with the newest books, getting those launched, getting them to find their readerships. If your book is successful in landing in a syllabus, getting taught, that starts to perpetuate the project over time as well. But it's not going to be, the focus of publishers is really upon the time of publication and the months surrounding that.
Can I just ask one more thing about how does a book get nominated for awards, and what is the role of the press versus the author in this process?
That is something that the press will do quite frequently. I think each publisher will tell you that we'll nominate for a certain number of awards. Beyond that, the author should also be prepared to nominate. It depends on award. There's some awards too that explicitly say publishers cannot nominate towards, and it has to be nominated by other members of that intellectual society or by the author themselves sometimes, and not publishers. Conversely, there are other awards where only publishers can nominate. At Stanford, when your manuscript goes into production, very early on, we ask all authors to complete a marketing questionnaire. So that's a good key place to outline where are your priorities and your interests for a project. What journals do you most want? Do you read? Do you most want to see reviews and are most hoped for? What awards are most important to you? And then we can talk through and creating a marketing team creates a marketing plan for each book that gets shared with our authors several months before publication. And so awards, list reviews, those things are part of a conversation between the author and the marketing team.
Hi, thank you so much. So I am Michael. I'm a dissertation writing fellow here this year, but I'm based in comparative literature at NYU, New York City. I'm writing my dissertation now, and I'm sort of interested in any thoughts you have about transitioning from a dissertation to a manuscript. I've had members of my committee say things to me like, don't write a dissertation, write the book. Just go right ahead and write the book, which sounds lovely, but it's hard for me to sort of imagine what they might mean by that. I've also received some mixed advice about, trying to publish maybe a condensed chapter of your dissertation, put it through peer review early. I was wondering also, is that something that publishers look at? Will you read kind of articles published from a manuscript? Does that encourage you or discourage you at any time from sort of accepting a manuscript? Just generally thinking about the sort of transition between a dissertation and a manuscript.
I would say if there's any piece of advice that I disagree with most that I hear is that write your dissertation as a book. I think even if I think of the hypothetical one that is done exactly the way it should be, because of the way dissertations are now available on through libraries and on platforms, there isn't a publishing model for that anymore. So and it's very clear that libraries know how to access and have are able to get dissertations. So there isn't a need to publish a book as well. So I say my advice is focus on your dissertation, write many people have said this is not unique to me. The best dissertation is finished dissertation, and just you have that done. And if you have the luxury of time to separate yourself from the dissertation, that's always a nice benefit to be able to step back and think through what material you have and what book you want to write from it. And certainly that the research basis, the ideas, what motivates you to do that dissertation is going to be deeply inform the book that you want to write, but those are two absolutely very different things. And I think you already said, the dissertation is written for the committee. The book needs to be, even if it's a specialist monograph, we're not talking, hopefully, hundreds of readers, not four. So that would be one practical piece of advice for anyone who's still working on your dissertation. Give it a clear but the worst title you possibly can. You cannot use your dissertation title as your book title, so don't lose your good title on your. Often I realize I say that after everyone has filed their dissertation, and I don't have a choice anymore. For the article, as I this may be my own preference. So I typically don't read or I don't treat articles as a writing sample for the book, because again, it's a different style of writing. It's a different format of writing. It's a different readership. And so I would want to see when I'm working with a new author early on, I always treat the proposal itself as a writing sample. I hope that the proposal can be written in that register and tone that the book is going to be written in, which is very, so even if a sample chapter is not yet available, I have a writing sample in the proposal.
Say too, just a big difference I see between dissertations and books is because a lot of people I work with are first-time authors, is that you often are writing a dissertation chapter by chapter, right? You write a chapter, you get feedback, you're just rushed trying to get the next chapter. So there's not necessarily a lot of time to think about the argument as a through line and to think about, like, ideally in a book, you can't just read the chapters in any order. The chapters build on each other, and like the end of the book leaves you in a different place than you were at the beginning. And so I think that's conceptual level work that's very hard to do when you're writing a dissertation, just because of the time crunch and so on. So that would be something you'd probably be thinking about as you move closer to the book.
Mm-hmm.
Laura?
Yes, thank you. I have a question about translation, and in particular, proposing books that have been initially published in another language, but also maybe for Katherine, how would the developmental editor work with a book that is being translated?
Can you just clarify, so how would a developmental editor work? Like what? Like once an author has translated a text?
So that's an interesting question, because my dissertation was written in French.
Okay.
I'm in the process of translating it, but then I was
So
really
you're
into
translating
different process,
Okay.
but also where to get published in French, for example, how does it work to have
So translation is more often than not, when we think of publishing a book in translation, it's to do the literal translation. And so there wouldn't be as much development or shift in content. That said, I know in my own work, I have worked with a number of authors who have done more substantial changes because the readership, the English language readership, is different than whatever the original language. So it could be, and that is something that has to be very clearly negotiated with whoever holds the rights. So I think there's a question of when you're publishing, does your publisher hold the English language rights, and would we be contracting the book directly with the foreign publisher, or do you as author retain those rights and we're contracting directly with the author? If we are doing a translation that also extends or changes or is different than the original publication, that's somewhere that I think development could get in. It helped to think through what is different about the English language readership than the native language. But we have to know early on and negotiate that with whoever the rights holder is, that we actually have the rights to do that translation.
And I should say there also are other kinds of freelance editors, so copy editors for sure, and line editors. So if you were doing a translation yourself and then wanted someone to go over it to make sure it's flowing well and that, you know, and so on, like based on, you could certainly find somebody who would specialize in that kind of work and be able, but it would be less developmental and more like a line by line focus.
There's another. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is about working with an author for a second time, potentially. Do you often work with an author again, or would you recommend to somebody who's already published their first book, potentially seeking out another press? And this is assuming, of course, that you had a good relationship with this person. But what are your thoughts about sort of continuing to work with the same author versus suggesting they might expand outward?
I always very much hope that my authors will have, one sitting here, a good experience with us. And I approach it, start working with authors, inviting their work, imagine it as an ongoing relationship. So certainly hope to see authors return to the press, to see their work develop. There are certainly occasions where that fit is not quite right. A second project is noticeably different. I've had experiences where someone publishes their second book elsewhere, but brings the third back, just because, again, there's that difference of where the lists are, what the particular ambitions and readerships of that project. But I think most of us certainly hope that our authors first are very pleased and that we've had a good experience, and that they'll stay with a publishing house and have that opportunity to develop and grow. I really enjoy seeing how work develops, how people choose what their next project's going to be, and having those longer standing relationships over time, not just a singular project.
I actually had, so Jessica and I had this conversation actually the other day, and she told me something really interesting about her first book process, where she tried to bring it to Tunisia, even though, and it was on Tunisia, and it was difficult to get local bookshops to be able to sell it. So like having her work on that place was difficult to disseminate locally. And I'm curious kind of like what your opinions are on that, because I think it's a really important thing to think about. You want your pub book in the community, I mean, I would assume in the community that you're talking about. So like, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah. So with Stanford, all of our books, we do distribute them globally. And I would agree absolutely that is a priority, or where the challenges can exist, as the cost may be one of them. I think it's my experience with our books in the Middle East in general, that's less a cost of the parity in pricing between a US edition and what would sell in the Middle East. More so that comes especially South Asia for our books. Indian editions can be very, the expectation in that market is books should be much cheaper than what the US edition would be. In that case, where we have something we'll license and partner with a publisher in India to release an edition there. Sometimes that's possible. Sometimes we prefer to pull and distribute a book internationally. We have a team that works with the press to place our books in bookstores. I think that there are challenges ultimately that are specific to region, but also just general to the book industry. If bookstores themselves choose what they want to take, what they think their readerships will be interested in. And so we have sales reps who can go and promote the books and encourage bookstores to take up books from our catalogs, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the bookstores on their side will feel that it's an appropriate book for their store as well.
Just to piggyback on that, and yes, working with, actually, I've had the pleasure of working with both of these individuals, and it's been absolutely wonderful. But that question, the translation question, what about translating works? And is that something, so what is does the press have preferences for how this happens? Does one approach a translator and then try and bring a contract back to the press for review to be able to get it to local markets?
standard contract, and most of our authors, the press holds this translation, all language rights. And I think that's actually a great benefit to use authors, because it is a business arrangement, usually arranged between publisher to publisher for translations. So I generally discourage authors from holding your own language rights unless you feel very strongly that you understand copyright law, negotiations, and can do that one-on-one with the publishers in the area. We have an active translation program at the press. We have an agent specifically who works with us to place Arabic language rights in the region and is based in the region, and work with a number of local publishers in a variety of countries here. And always we can give authors, and this is not unique to Stanford, any publisher can, if before signing any agreement with a foreign publisher, would tell you, we've had interest from this publisher for this language. Does this sound reasonable? So if there, especially if there are political concerns or leanings of a certain publisher, you have the opportunity still, even though the publisher is the one negotiating it, you would have the opportunity to say yes or no to that. Similarly, if it's a language that you know with any passing familiarity or fluency, if you want to have the right to review the translation, to choose the translator, that can be, we can negotiate that into the contract with the foreign publisher. So I think that's, there are a few books where we do allow, where the author asks and feels quite confident in holding, Arabic language might be one of them, rights, but I think it does present certain challenges, and then you have to be able to go and find the publisher. It's the same process we're talking about for your English language book, but now with regional publishers or your local publishers here. And it's similar contract negotiations, permissions, all those legal terms.
And these might be questions that, again, would be good to talk to presses as you're deciding which press you want to go with. Like, do they have programs like this in place, and what does this look like? Yeah.
Since we're on the topic of the law, I'm curious about some. Sorry, this is a very everything you've ever wanted to know about the publishing industry. Yeah. Prepared to ask thing. When I published my first book, the university press I signed with had a clause in the contract that my next book would be theirs first. Yeah. It would be first buyer. Which sounded somewhat rubbish to me. Yeah. In your world, is this something I have to abide to? I might do it out of gratefulness or whatever, but I feel like, come on, I can probably just do whatever I want for my second book. But in your industry, would you feel like, no, this is really binding, and we can't look at a book manuscript if it was understood that you'd have to submit it to somebody else first? Yeah.
It is a contractual clause, so I won't not say don't ignore it. If it's in your contract and you've signed your contract, then we put them in at Stanford. I leave it by each of my editors at their discretion. Some of these publish again for the same. You hope that authors come back to us, or working with people. So we'd love to see that second project. It formalizes that statement early on. I'd like to see it. Double check the specific terms of the clause. Often they're pretty loose. They just expect you to submit your proposal or manuscript, and the publisher has 30 days or 2 months or something to get back and say, yes, we'd like to see it. It probably doesn't even specify that, even if the publisher comes back and says, yes, I'd like to invite this, that you must submit only to them. They're somewhat toothless clauses, I would say.
Have you ever heard of anyone being sued for not abiding?
I have not heard of anyone.
Yeah, it's contractual, but what's your point?
I would say my advice would be, I think it's, and I have not heard of anyone being sued, but I think it would leave a bad taste in someone's mouth to ignore it completely. And in that sense, you're developing, even if the next book is not the right fit with that publisher, you might want to go back to them in several years and to find out that you ignored that clause. I think it burns a bridge that you don't need to. But I've certainly had people go and say, I personally don't like them. I hope that people will return and work with me because they like the press and they liked working with me, and I don't want anyone feeling like, so I don't actually put those in my own contracts. But I do know many occasions where people have gone to other publishers and said, I have this contraction, I need to share this proposal with you. I really think it's going to be a better fit with this other press. Will you release me from this? And that's satisfied everything. So I think you absolutely have that conversation, but again, be transparent and frank with the publisher. That's all they're asking for, I think.
I have a question regarding the times that you agree on to submit the manuscript. So is it something you agree on with the authors at an early stage? And sometimes we could say it would take like a year to finish the manuscript, but many times I don't know how frequent does it happen that you need more time. How strict are you on these deadlines? And how
That one depends on if it's the deadline is a contractual deadline, or just a statement in your proposal of the schedule we're working on, and what else the planning is based on. I think it's always helpful to hold to, you know, the reason we have contractual deadlines, the reason we're setting, because we're planning our publishing seasons and looking very far. I'm working right now on trying to look at, you know, what am I going to be publishing in spring of 2025 and the fall of 2025, and to start to, and I invite projects based on what I know I already have invited, what I'm planning for these future years. So having some sense of where, you know, realistic sense of when someone is likely to submit a project for review, what is under contract and I know is coming in for production. And the closer we're getting to that contractual date or to a publication, the more strict we hope to be with us. That said, I think you would never want to rush a book to publication. It's always better to have the project well done. So I don't want to sit here and say that contracts don't matter and you can ignore that clause, or we have flexibility. There is a reason for having, especially in a contract, a publication date. But I understand, editors completely understand, things happen, projects take longer, life intervenes, and that's part of the relationship with the editor, of having open conversation about where are you, and starting to readjust publication dates. Well, we can extend contract clauses.
I'd also say, if you have said to an editor, again, maybe not contractually, but like, I plan to turn this book in 2 years, and it's 5 years down the road, don't be afraid to go back and ask. They can always say no, but I've worked with multiple authors who are like, I'm so late. And in most cases, the press said, yes, we'd still like to see the book. So don't just like disappear, because the press can always say, no, I'm sorry, we're no longer interested. And you do risk the editor leaving, or, you know, things changing, but definitely that does happen. So don't be afraid.
So it occurs to me that we've been having the conversation, I think, entirely, at least, with a single authored work in mind. And I'm wondering if there are any different approaches that either of you would take for jointly authored work, or edited volumes, which is the sort of the original model of the jointly authored work in the humanities. Are these? Does this change anything for either of you and how you go about assessing the manuscript or developing the projects?
Probably not too much, I think. I think one question to see in, you know, jointly authored is, I'd be curious, you know, what is the relationship between the author pair? How are you working together? How do you create a coherent voice in what you're writing when it's two different people working together? But the qualities that I'd be looking for in a manuscript, the expectations I would have for a book would remain the same. You just have two people working together. Edited volumes are edited volumes are tough, I would say, both from a publishing standpoint and I think from your own of working on them. I think that we've definitely seen, I think, a decline. Maybe that gets back to the very first question you were asking about, you know, where are the shifts in the marketplace? I don't think edited volumes necessarily are as attractive a format. And I will say to anyone, whenever someone starts to pitch to me that they want to edit a volume, I'm usually very skeptical. I really think close. It's much more work than you'd ever imagine. It's much harder to do than writing your own book. And the only way to, I think, to make them attractive and to be successful, you really have to have a very strong hand in pulling people together and making sure there's a coherency in the volume. It's not simply collecting papers and putting them together. So I try to go out of my way to dissuade people from considering edited volumes, probably, just because there's so many challenges to it. There's always exceptions to that. I have published edited volumes and some of them have been quite successful. So I'll never draw a firm line and saying that they're, you know, that they don't work at all, but they're very, very tough, I think, to conceive of in a compelling way.
It's another moment too to like take into consideration carefully where you are at in your scholarly trajectory. And again, like, they are so much work, and The pieces will be of different quality. They will come in at vastly different times. People will miss deadlines dramatically. And so if you are a junior scholar really needing your own book for tenure or whatever it is, right, don't be careful if you take on a second project like that, because it does just take a lot of time. Yeah.
So, so going back to Mark's earlier point about open access, how has it changed the publishing scene? Because when I published, that time we weren't making our scholarship open access, and then later on I went back to making one of my chapters open access. And what happened that it changed the broader argument of my book, because this chapter was the one which was out in the open domain. So is that something which changes the way we should think about our project?
I think that's an interesting scenario, and I haven't thought of it quite that, but there are two ways that open access comes about. One is books are born open access and we published at the beginning, which potentially doesn't change it so substantially, in conceiving of the project. And the key there is it's a financial consideration. Then the money that would have come to support the production costs, the development of the book, through the sales of the book have to come upfront, usually through some funding agency. Each publisher is going to have different amount that they would expect of payment up front to cover an open access cost. I don't know if there's your scenario the other, and I've certainly experienced this myself, of people coming back to ask for, but more so usually entire books to become open after publication. Still, usually there is a payment and a fee to support that open access, though it's going to be a lesser amount than something that is published born OA. I don't know if there's a way to actually, though, anticipate if an individual chapter comes out. I think I can, now that you say that, I hadn't really thought that through. I can see exactly what you're saying, and how that piece now has changed the way people are approaching the project. I don't know if I would, that you can anticipate that necessarily unless you know which chapter you're opening up. And I generally disagree with the idea of chunking material, of having individual chapters, and going back to what you were saying, Catherine, about dissertations too, of looking at a chapter without thinking through the entire arc of the book. A book needs to be coherent. It should have an arc to it. And so being able to, I strongly, I guess, just disagree with the idea of developing books now with individual chapters to be taken apart in that way. There are certainly publishing houses that publish in that way. Stanford's not one of them. But OA, for me, I think most of our conversations, at least ours and House and Stanford, have been more around the financial side of it, and not as much of the intellectual side of the access of it. But just how it shifted the business model of publishing for us.
And that's something, again, you'll want to be like, because I know many of you might end up at different institutions, be thinking about early. If you want to do open access, be paying attention to funding that might be available at your institution to support efforts like that as well.
It's 1:27. We're scheduled to go to 1:30. Is there any last question? Yeah.
I mean, it's a straightforward question, although you're discouraged from edited volumes, but it's about the proposal for edited volumes. You were mentioning the narrative and like how one author book would develop, like have like in its proposal the chapter to chapter development. So I'm just curious how that model transforms to the edited volume.
What's important is to see how the chapters speak to each other. How do they fit together? What is the structure? And why? There still has to be a logic to why did you put the chapters in this order in the book? And it may not. Is it for some edited volumes? It could be because there is something, a reason that you need to read them in order. And others, it may be there's a structure of grouping books thematically within chapters thematically within the parts. But it'd still be looking to see, presumably there was some thought process in why you would put the chapters in the order you did. How does that come through in a book proposal? Or thinking through, what order do you want to put in an edited volume the chapters?
Yeah, but that's my question. Is the order already mandatory that early? Maybe as a theater maker, I think more in mind maps.
Yeah.
So I would think there is a curatorial line of what is being put together, but my instinct would have been to create the order after the contributions are solidly finished, to to create the structure based on that. So that's why
I guess, so that
struggling.
was exactly, I was making the assumption and that the chapters are already finished. And then with, I think one key difference just in general with edited volumes and my own evaluation of them from authored books is I think I can't evaluate them at a proposal stage because there is too much that's up in the air about them exactly, because there's so many different authors, so many different pieces. We want to really you can't get a good sense of what the book is going to be in a fixed sense until it's actually written. So first, we don't do advanced reviews of proposal material in an edited volume. We want to see a proposal once all the material is done and ready so that you could actually look at it and know what order the chapters should be in and understand how the book comes together. So that, so with the edited volume and the proposal, we look at it, and it has to be a much more finalized stage than potentially you might start talking with an author, with a publisher, with just a single authored book.
Well, thank you very much for